Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Susan Henshaw Jones, and it is my great Thank you so much. It is my great honor to serve as the Ronay Menschel Director of the Museum of the City of New York. And I welcome you here today for the Symposium, Redefining Preservation for the 21st Century, which launches our exhibition, Saving Place, 50 Years of New York City Landmarks. Indeed, 50 years ago yesterday, on April 19th, 1965, was the very day Mayor Robert Wagner signed the Landmarks Law. And I think it's so terrific that throughout the town there have been so many programs and events and exhibitions that have been organized to commemorate this important moment and to consider the impact of the law. So, when this symposium is concluded, I invite you all across the street to see our exhibition and also to enjoy a reception. I do note that the Museum of the City of New York is a perfect place, a very appropriate place to carry out such a project as Saving Place, for we are the city's official museum, and we occupy a city-owned building. It has been our charge to connect the past, the present, and the future, and to celebrate the city's diversity, opportunity, and perpetual transformation. Now, this show means a lot to me because I have a personal history in preservation, becoming involved in the early 1970s when I was in the administration of Mayor John V. Lindsay. Mayor Lindsay, there's a other Lindsay I said there, he was a tremendous advocate for New York's urbanism, and he embraced preservation as a remedy for saving the city. And in his 2 terms, there were designated a very hefty number of buildings and districts, and I think that was shown on an earlier slide. I then became the 2nd and later the 4th head of the newly created New York Landmarks Conservancy, getting to know the early activists, these mostly polite firebrands. They included Joan Davidson and the J.M. Kaplan Fund. Hang on a sec. Margot Gale, Brendan Gill, Ralph Menapace, Otis Pratt Pearsall, Barbara Lee Diamondstein Spielvogel, Kent Barwick, Fred Papert, the list goes on and on. You know, 50 years is not that long ago. And today, Joan Davidson and Otis Pearsall are here with us. And I want them to stand so that we can give them a big round of applause. Otis is so singularly responsible for the law. Joan is so singularly responsible for the network of nonprofit preservation organizations that the Kaplan Fund made grants to, and all of the legal and advocacy work that had to be done when the Grand Central Terminal case made its way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And yes, that was some crucial win for preservation. Now, New Yorkers have a tendency to focus excessively and also to lose sight of their city. And I think this is perfectly normal, but I do salute Iwan Ban, who I saw just walked in. He is a photographer from the Netherlands, whom we commissioned to take photographs in all 5 boroughs. His work makes very, very clear that landmarks preservation is a source of urban dynamism, the mix of old and new that New York is famous for today. So, Iwan, are you here? I saw you walk. There's Iwan. Thank you very much. Thank you, Iwan. Also, his work shows that our frequently contentious landmark process has inspired developers, architects, and owners to respond creatively to building preservation and to new construction in an historic district. Now, the idea for doing this exhibition across the street and a book by the very same name, which is co-published with Monticelli Press, came from Bob Tierney, who was then the chairman of the Landmarks Preservation Commission, and from Tony Wood, who is the chairman of the New York Preservation Archive Project. But the group who made the project a reality was a committee of co-chairs who galvanized support from every quarter. And co-chairs in the room, I believe, are Fred Bland, Jim Hanley, Hugh Hardy, Jack Kerr, Richard Olcott, and Bob Tierney. And would you all stand? Did I miss anybody? Did anybody come in addition to that group? Will you stand? Thank you so very, very much. And I also salute all of the chairs of the Landmarks Preservation Commission who lent their names as honorary co-chairs, and 4 of them I hope are here: Lori Beckelman, Beverly Moss-Spat, hi Beverly, Meenakshi Srinivasan, and Bob Tierney. I think they should stand too. Finally, I salute our very able curatorial team of Donald Albrecht, the City Museum's curator of architecture and design, Andrew Dolkart, an eminent historian and the head of the Historic Preservation Program at Columbia's Graduate School of Architecture, and Sari Warden, former director of the Fitch Foundation, all expertly assisted by Sarah Spink. And yes. And today's symposium and all the public programs have been skillfully organized by Julie Trebeau. So I do want you to watch out for the upcoming programming, and I think we gave you a postcard listing all the programs when you came in the door. These programs are made possible with the support of the New York Landmarks Preservation Foundation. So now, of course, you see a very high-powered panel of urbanists to my left, and they're here to discuss the challenges and opportunities of the preservation movement going forward. The City Museum prides itself on being a neutral forum, but in this case, neutrality is going to ensure a very lively group dynamic. That's a good thing. Bios are in your programs, but I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists. Michael Kimmelman is an author and pianist and the architecture critic for the New York Times. Claudette Brady is a community preservationist and co-founder of the Bedford Stuyvesant Society for Historic Preservation. Robert A.M. Stern is Dean of Yale School of Architecture, senior partner of Robert A.M. Stern Architects, and one of the foremost historians of New York's architecture and urbanism. Steve Spinola is the longest-serving president of the Real Estate Board of New York. I was hearing it's 29 years. That's really a great achievement. Vishaan Chakrabarti is a partner at Shop Architects and a professor at Columbia's Graduate School of Architecture. Roberta Gratz is a journalist, lecturer, and author of 5 acclaimed books on urban development. And Adele Chatfield-Taylor is our moderator. Adele spent the last 2 decades as president and CEO of the American Academy in Rome, but she began her career in preservation and at the Landmarks Preservation Commission. Before we begin, we are so thrilled that we have with us on this day the city's Deputy Mayor for Housing and Economic Development, Alicia Glenn, who is going to say a few words. And I really think this is very, very appropriate because preservation has been an engine for economic development in New York City. And here she is, and we're just thrilled that you're here. Come on up, Alicia. And then, I just want to say that Alicia is going to be followed by Meenakshi Srinivasan, who is the new chair of the Landmarks Preservation Commission. Alicia.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Susan, so much for that lovely introduction, but actually, much more importantly, for all the work you've done, not just for the museum, but for the city of New York, that you clearly love so much. We're about to lose you in one role, but hope to have you stay part of the broader family for many, many decades to come. Let's give her another round of applause. She's amazing. Amazing. It's just fabulous. I want to be brief because I don't want to even think about getting in the middle of this crew because this is going to be very interesting. I like to consider myself an urbanist, but you have quite an interesting panel here tonight. But I really would like to thank everybody at the Museum of the City of New York and the Landmarks Preservation Commission for mounting what is a really fascinating exhibition that recounts the story of New York City and how it learned to protect and celebrate its architecturally significant buildings and its historic neighborhoods. This exhibition and, of course, tonight's forum really pays homage to the heroic efforts of the preservationists, the designers, the elected officials, the civic groups, and, of course, all of the commissioners who are part of this extraordinary legacy. And I think it's fair to say that New York is a city that is constantly evolving, where the old and the new mix and sometimes collide, but they do in a way that produces a singular and dynamic place. It is a city where the past informs the future, but has not and should not impede change or innovation. Let's face it, when it comes to thinking about what makes New York City unique, it's sometimes the exasperating, often contentious sort of drama which unfolds in front of us. And it's this richness of its history, whether it's played out in debates about the built environment or what our economic future should and can be. It is that melting pot that comes from the differences and diversity of opinions and the extraordinary diverse history of the city. And it's hard sometimes for the younger generation, I think, to understand what this means. And so I often like to cite what I call my daughter saying, "What does this mean in real life, Mom? What is all this stuff you talk about?" And I think as a lifelong New Yorker and certainly as an Upper West Sider, preservation and the history of the city is very much steeped in my own experience. And I tell my children this anecdote about some of the debates that we're facing. As an Upper West Sider, I grew up going to the Museum of Natural History all the time, and of course spent many, many days as a child and a teenager at the Hayden Planetarium. And you can suffice it to say that those were very interesting times. I won't go into too much about what happened in the teenage years, but there were very interesting things that went on in the Hayden Planetarium. So naturally, I was horrified when I heard of the plans to knock it down. Nothing was more New York than that structure. The fate, the gestalt, the whole Upper West Side was hanging in the balance. And then I fast forward 15 years, and I'm taking my girls to the Rose Center, and I'm blown away by how beautiful the physical structure is, how well its contemporary architecture works with the surrounding neighborhood, and equally as important, how incredible the programming is, how it is actually made to essentially science-phobic little girls look at the world with new eyes and want to learn more. And who knows how many more emerging researchers, innovators, and entrepreneurs have been inspired by that new building. But that building is so integrated into, and in fact exists because it is part of an institution that is both literally and figuratively grounded in the past. So building the Rose Center was not without controversy, nor was landmarking the first private interior, which was a Four Seasons restaurant. That was the first thing I worked on when I worked for David Dinkins. And nor will there be other opportunities for us to have those kinds of debates. But all of those debates have helped shape the New York we all love today. And how does that work for our future? Our administration's goal is to protect and promote the buildings and the neighborhoods that exemplify the diverse and rich fabric of New York, while simultaneously embracing and catalyzing growth that will allow us all to remain part of this amazing global center of commerce and culture, and simultaneously be the model for an equitable and dynamic world city. And despite some chatter to the contrary and about the controversy, preservation is critical to attaining those goals. This administration has already added significantly to the roster of landmarks. The Commission has designated nearly 1,800 buildings over the past 16 months. That's 7 times more buildings than we're designating during the same time frame as the prior administration. But it's not just about the numbers. We are determined to make sure that conversations about historic resources do not simply focus on the city's past, but are fully integrated into our discussions about the future, because that is smart preservation and smart planning. So no longer in its own silo or distinct from our other planning efforts and economic development agenda, we are making the Commission a true partner in our citywide agenda, including things as big as planning the rezoning of East Midtown, as well as all of the neighborhood work we're doing to advance our ambitious and necessary housing goals. Simply put, preservation and development can go hand in hand and reinforce each other. We know this to be true. We have seen vibrant and commercially successful neighborhoods like Soho, Dumbo, the Broadway Theater District, benefit greatly from the preservation of their historic character alongside significant economic development. And so we also need to do this in an efficient way. We need to be efficient preservationists, building on the record time for landmark designations already seen under the current administration. For example, the Chester Court Historic District in Brooklyn was calendared, heard, and designated within 2 months. So when we mean it, we do it. And we'll also do equitable preservation, recognizing and protecting resources that exist throughout the 5 boroughs, and particularly in neighborhoods that have not received as much focus in the past. So again, just last week, we designated the Stone Avenue branch of the Brooklyn Public Library in Brownsville, one of the few undesignated Carnegie-era libraries. And it was the first children's library in the country. What an amazing resource for this city to have for centuries to come. So this comprehensive and balanced approach is aimed to foster a conducive environment for creating the next generation's landmarks and meeting the evolving everyday needs of New Yorkers without compromising the rich past that we celebrate today and that makes our city so unique. So the mayor and I and everybody else in the administration celebrates with you today, celebrates the prior 50 years of landmarking, and looks forward to welcoming the next 50 years of landmarks in New York City. Thank you so much. And I will now segue to reintroduce the fabulous Meenakshi Srinivasar, who's the chairwoman of the Landmarks Preservation Commission. Let me tell you, nobody is working harder than Meenakshi, not only to implement our vision for a future of New York that builds upon the strength of its past, but she is dedicated to making the commission itself be a little less of a landmark and more of a modern agency, integrated with the rest of the administration, and more responsive to all of its constituents. So please welcome Meenakshi.
Well, wow. First of all, I'd like to thank Deputy Mayor Alicia Glenn for articulating an ambitious preservation platform that will ensure that New York continues to remain one of the most distinctive, dynamic, and powerful cities. And she's I've got my work cut out for me now. My heartfelt thanks and appreciation to Susan Jones, for organizing this exhibition and symposium to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Landmarks Law and the Landmarks Preservation Commission. The Commission is very proud to partner with the Museum of New York on this event to bring the history of preservation movement, as well as the work of the Commission, to a whole new generation of New Yorkers. Since it was founded, the Landmarks Preservation Commission has emerged as an absolutely essential guardian of New York's architectural and cultural legacy. Over 33,000 buildings and sites, including 114 historic districts and 21 extensions, are protected. In the past 9 months, over 1,700 buildings have been designated. Over the past year, 13,000 permits for work on landmark sites have been issued. These activities reflect the agency's commitment, and my commitment personally, to its mission to protect our historic buildings and sites and to enable designated buildings and neighborhoods to continue to function and evolve, respectful of the historic character as the city continues to grow. This is a great moment for us to congratulate all those who have worked tirelessly over the years to protect our heritage. Several who are here today are past chairs and commissioners, a very, very active and robust preservation community and neighborhood groups, elected officials, architects, designers, planners. They're all here, and property owners as well. But this is also an opportunity to reflect on what we've been successful for, what lessons we've learned, and how we should think about preservation to meet the challenges for the next 50 years. This symposium will definitely enhance that dialogue. And with that, I'd like to thank all of you, and I eagerly await to hear what our esteemed panelists have to say. Thank you very much.
Adele Chatfield-Taylor.
Thank you. Wow, Susan just gave us some more time. Thank you, Deputy Mayor Glenn, Chair Srinivasan, and Susan and your staff, all of whom have been mentioned several times, for this tremendous effort you've put into this exhibition and the gathering. It's wonderful to see so many old friends here. It marks such an historic event. Historic preservation has never been universally appreciated. It's not mother's milk to everyone in this city. But for those of us who participated in this work for these 5 decades, we cannot help but be grateful for our law and determined to make its implementation even better in the years to come. We have a very nice balance among our speakers, and we've asked each one to start with a word, and then we'll to sort of make an initial presentation for a minute or two, and then we will open it up and ask each one some questions. That opening question, for which they're going to respond to in their opening comment, is the law effective? And where do you see it as strong? And where do you see that there is room for improvement? I'd like to sort of pre-note that everyone I've spoken to has said that the most common criticism is that the agency is so underfunded. So I expect to hear that again, but certainly let's not have that be the only thing that gets said. Let us start with you, Vishaan.
Thank you, Adele. So I'm going to quickly answer and say yes, I do believe the law is effective. But in order to talk about improvements, I think one has to look back. It's interesting that, and a wonderful thing that the law is 50 years old. That's something to celebrate. Something perhaps not to celebrate is I am also turning 50 this year. And I think about that. I think about the fact that Penn Station was torn down 2 years before my birth, and how much has changed since 1965. We just heard from we heard from several extraordinary women, but 2 extraordinary women who are elected officials or appointed officials, Deputy Mayor Glenn and Chairwoman Srinivasan, and I would put to you that in 1965 it would be highly unlikely that two women were speaking to us as senior city officials. I would put to you that in 1965 it would be highly unlikely that an architect of my particular skin tone would be speaking to this august group. And so those social and cultural dynamics are not separate somehow from our built environment. Change, I would argue, is one of the most fundamental characteristics of this city. And I believe that one of the things we should do with the law, with the LPC, is somehow embrace and guide change, as opposed to thinking about how to stop it. Because change is not just a nice thing. For many of us, it is an urgent need. As an architect, I believe that our role is basically to read the city and tell its tale back to it. And that is why those kinds of social changes are part of what ultimately becomes part of our built environment. And so if what I'm saying is right, that LPC's basic role is to guide and preserve New York's spirit of change, then I'm going to also say that LPC is not actually the guardian of our past. It is the guardian of the future of our past. And this is, I believe, an extremely important distinction. And if you think about it, it explains why so many of our old buildings are such wonderful, living, breathing monuments and legacies. We did a study at Columbia. This city, in the last 10 years, created 300,000 technology jobs. That's an extraordinary number. That's almost the number of jobs we lost in the 1970s when the Son of Sam was running around. So 300,000 is a lot. It's important, and it's important diversity. What's interesting is we found that 85% of those jobs are housed in pre-war buildings. 70% are in landmarks. LPC has been very much guiding this change. If you look at 200 Fifth Avenue, if you look at the Flatiron District, meatpacking, Dumbo, and so forth, that embrace of change is extraordinarily important to the ecology of our city. Similarly, our firm has had wonderful experiences with LPC as of late on our building next to the Steinway building, where we had unanimous LPC approval in 3 months. Thank you very much, both Chairs Tierney and Chairs Srinivasan. And in that was an understanding, and I would tell you that that building is better because it went through landmarks. We had an intellectual dialogue with the Commission about how to merge new and old in a way that phenomenally improved the architecture. So what are the criticisms? I worry about the growth of historic districts where there is no historic fabric. Gas stations and parking lots don't belong in our understanding of historic districts, and especially when they are used as backyard downs or backdoor down zonings. Land use should be land use and should be regulated by city planning. But I think the larger, and it's not a criticism, but question I would ask, is that I think in democratic society, the hardest thing to find is a spokesperson for the future. The future does not have agency in the construct of our social and political milieu. And so one of the things that one has to ask, and I think Deputy Mayor Glenn mentioned it, is this notion of future landmarks. And how is it that we are going to encourage future landmarks and the embrace of change? And to that I would just close with Penn Station. Because Penn Station, which started this story for so many of us and has consumed so many of our lives in terms of its rebuilding, the Farley building will, as an Amtrak station, will be fine. It is a step. But I will leave you with the thought that the only way we are going to solve Penn Station, create a safe Penn Station, a glorious Penn Station, is by replacing where Madison Square Garden is today, certainly not a landmark, and building a real train station worthy of this great city. Thank you.
Thank you, Vishaan. Michael, have a go.
Yeah, thanks. And I hope we return to Madison Square Garden and Penn Station, as you can imagine. And I would echo much of what Vishaan said, but I'd like to focus on one particular case today. So I've written something out. I hope you don't mind if I read it. I do think we're at a critical moment in terms of urban development in New York. You know, preservationists can ossify NIMBY views, and City Hall, I think, can narrow its focus on affordable housing units Or we can all think more truly about the city's health and welfare and understand that buildings, whether they're landmarks or just vanilla apartment blocks, don't exist in a vacuum. They belong to streets, neighborhoods, communities, which need to be nurtured holistically. And it is very often the spaces between these buildings which need to be safeguarded. Robert Moses built lots of units of housing for poor New Yorkers, but he didn't build neighborhoods. And so we ended up with ghettos. Preservationists, I think, also must strategize in terms of placemaking, community building, and a larger urban ecosystem, and not, that is, just be NIMBY views. I've just reviewed the new Whitney Museum downtown, which now culturally anchors the meatpacking district at the south end of the High Line. Many of you here will recall proposals over the years to expand Breuer's Whitney building on Madison Avenue. The Whitney made all sorts of pleas to the public and City Hall that were inevitably mixed up with economic benefits from tourism and with sustaining New York's cultural primacy. And some big-name architects, Renzo Piano, Michael Graves, Rem Koolhaas, came up with expansion plans. Whatever you think of the new Whitney building, I suspect most of you would agree that it's a very good thing Breuer's building survived those schemes. Now the building that Breuer built should, I think, be landmarked, and the Metropolitan Museum, which is taking it over, should not tamper with it. Just think what a disaster it would have been for the Whitney, the city, and posterity had Graves' makeover moved forward. It had a kind of faux historicism, a kind of contextual gambit that, in retrospect, was very deeply ill-considered. So rejecting expansion there thwarted some powerful interests and delayed the Whitney, but ultimately resulted in a far better and more progressive outcome for the city, as well as the museum. Now, the Frick is contemplating an expansion. It's a beloved institution. Every true-blooded adult New Yorker wants it to thrive, and it would be tragic for the city, a lasting shame, really, if the museum squandered its reputation and spoiled its glory by getting this wrong. So far as I know, there is So far as I know, there is outside the Frick next to zero support for the current proposed expansion, and for very good reason. The plan, which is another historical knockoff, as unobtrusive as a McMansion and a Muse, is also very deeply ill-considered. And we're only slowly coming, I think, to acknowledge that landscape design deserves the same respect as architecture. Decades ago, the Frick very admirably hired a very important landscape architect named Russell Page to devise a garden on a site adjacent to the museum, where the museum officials envisioned future growth. The garden ended up being quite lovely, the only completed work by Page in the city. Those officials might not have wanted anything permanent or valuable. But sometimes a baby is left on our doorstep, and what are we to do? Now, almost 40 years have passed, which is closing in on almost as long as the McKim-Meade-White Penn Station was around before it was demolished. Generations have now grown up with this garden and know its particular value, the serendipity of its open space, the respite it provides from the street wall, the crucial role it plays in sustaining the domestic scale of the Frick and the Frick's mansion, and conveying an intimacy that is the reverse of what Central Park provides. Restoring townhouses that were torn down on the garden site would be almost as bad as what the Frick is contemplating at this point. We don't need to go backward. The Frick's home is great, but a fragile landmark which sets a very high bar for any architecture added to it. I know there are currently schemes out there that could give the Frick all it needs and also save the garden. We need to think of institutions like the Frick as part of the larger cultural and social ecosystem of the city, not just as a building or a cherished cultural constituent that should be given carte blanche. We need to think about preservation in terms of landscape and open space. I know I am joined by many New Yorkers in hoping that the Landmarks Commission can do the right thing, help save the garden, and compel the Frick to go back to the drawing board and prevent a historic mistake. Thank you.
Michael, we'll go back to the question of whether the law will work in terms of...
You noticed I ignored that, didn't you?
I did. Claudette, will you have a go?
Good evening. The law has been effective, and I'm going to say it again. Our major problem right now is that the agency is underfunded. We need a little more transparency. I know the new commissioner is working on that, so we know where we are in the process. What I would like to see, and I guess this is outside of Landmark or within the city administration itself, is to take a broader look at the historic neighborhoods or historic districts, not necessarily district, but historic neighborhoods, especially now that we're talking about conservation and affordable housing. And it seems for many that the two cannot go hand in hand, which it definitely does. What we're looking at, especially in central Brooklyn, where I'm from, in Bedford, Stuyvesant, and Crown Heights, we're looking at neighborhoods where a significant portion of our flats buildings or apartment buildings are rent regulated. Under the new housing preservation plan, the new affordable housing plan, we might see a lot of those buildings torn down and replaced by new buildings, which would cause significant displacement for many of the long-term residents in those neighborhoods. These are two neighborhoods in New York City. Bed-Stuy in particular was like one of the first neighborhoods in New York City where African Americans could afford to buy a house or could buy a house without having to suffer through a lot of the discriminatory practices of the past. And many of my neighbors who have been there for, since 1939 bought those houses despite redlining and all the other obstacles of the day. So within those districts, we are looking at affordable housing for the members of that community and long-term members of that community. And what I would really like to see from this administration is possibly more financial incentives, not just for smaller homeowners, but for homeowners who have, or building owners, flat owners, some incentives for them to maintain, preserve the affordable housing in those units, and also some incentives like the federal preservation tax credits for them to restore and rehabilitate those buildings. So that is my view for a comprehensive approach, not just to preservation, but to the affordable housing problem in New York City right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudette. Stephen.
Thank you. Has it been effective? I think if you look back and try to determine what was the purpose of the commission, if you believe it was to designate, and after 31,000 properties have been designated, I would assume you have to say from that narrow interpretation, it's been very effective. What are the issues? The issues are serious. The word transparency is very important. I don't know how in a government process in previous administrations you have thousands of properties being considered for landmarking, and the report that explains why it's worthy of being a district of that size is not issued until after the Landmarks Commission votes, and in some cases the City Council votes. If we're supposed to have public hearings and have a dialogue about why, what makes sense of it, then we need that transparency, and yet there is nothing. The only rule, I guess, or the only criteria for landmarking is that something is 30 years old. Well, we need a process, which I believe the current administration is attempting to create. We're creating all of these districts, and I think we're now up to 111 historic districts around the city. And yet owners, small property owners, large property owners, would welcome some guidelines as to how they are supposed to function with the creation of these districts. What kind of windows, what kind of storefronts, what kind of material. And if the Landmarks Commission, which is clearly understaffed, and for decades we have been calling upon greater funding for the Landmarks Commission, if it understands why it's designating the landmark district, then it should be able to articulate the kind of guidelines so that an owner can come in and understand what they are allowed to do and not allowed to do. So are there problems with the current law? There are serious problems with the current law. And because we are now at, the number is 4% of the city, 28% of Manhattan is now covered by landmark protection. And it raises a serious issue as to where the city's future is going to be. Yes, we want to build more housing. And we should not be tearing down worthy buildings that are worthy of landmark status. But to, as Vishaan said, to throw in districts that on the outer boundaries of the district are empty lots and gas stations that need to be demolished, then that is really a misuse of the landmarks law and an attempt to basically stop development from happening. And so we've got to somehow marry our love for the past and what has been great about the city of New York, but give an opportunity for future landmarks to be built all over the city.
Thank you, Stephen. Roberta. And before we move away from you, Stephen, I think we should have a marker that the criterion include several other considerations other than just the age of the building being 30 years older, but we can circle back to that. Roberta, please.
The law works, and in case one hasn't noticed, preservation has not stopped enormous change in this city. But 50 years of the landmarks law should be cause for celebration in the real estate community. Preservation has stimulated economic development in a big way and led to the upgrading of rundown neighborhoods. Developers are getting rich on the buildings we would not let them tear down. Adapting landmarks to new uses, building new within the historic districts they opposed, adding to the city's evolving urbanism. Developers didn't even know where Brooklyn was before preservationists fought Moses projects in Brooklyn Heights.
We all came from Brooklyn.
But not developers. And Brownstoners pioneered Park Slope. Since then, 114 historic districts have been designated, and developers cash in on those once disinvested areas. The real estate community would have us believe they know what's best for the larger city, that preservation has gone too far, that we need to compete with Singapore, with more 90-story towers with tax breaks for Russian oligarchs. Yet historically, they seem to work against what's best. Property owners along the High Line wanted it demolished, but two young neighborhood guys knew better, and the rest is history. Developers opposed the designation of the meatpacking district as well. They opposed lights and advertising on the towers of the new Times Square and the designation of Broadway's historic theaters. They supported the Lower Manhattan Expressway that would have wiped out Soho, Tribeca, and much of the Village, where real estate is now a gold-plated industry. They favored Westway, where instead the largest new park since Central Park has been created, stimulating the luxury condos now overlooking it. Now they want to hollow out the law with seemingly small changes. They complain that 28% of Manhattan is designated. Well, 28% of Manhattan and less than 4% citywide is not enough. London, Paris, Rome, and all great cities need their great historic buildings. If a building or a district is worthy, it is not too much. Let's not blame preservation for the lack of affordable housing. The affordable housing problem is worst in the outer boroughs where there is no landmarking. The real problem is displacement and harassment of existing tenants in affordable units in the assemblage of sites on which existing affordable units are being demolished to build new so-called affordable units that are too expensive for the displaced tenants to qualify for. So let's get on with focusing on historic preservation. Let's improve the Commission's work through more budget increases, I know that's been said, and through a few little technical changes that can be done without legal change to the law itself. It's worked for 50 years. Let's keep it working for another 50.
Thank you, Roberta. Bob Stern.
My first rule of preservation is don't follow Roberta Gratz. But I wasn't given a choice. I really, everything intelligent that could be said that I can think of has already been said. I would simply say that our landmarks not only celebrate our love for the past, but also for the future. 50 years ago, I was an architecture student. Nobody told me that I should go to New York to march in front of the Pennsylvania station. But within 2 years, I was waving the same flag that so many people in this room have waved over the years. It was confidence in the future and saving the city for the future and building upon it that was the basis for preservation. City planning was a failure. City planning is a failure. It is not physical, it is not social in its dimension, it's statistical. This is not a statistic we live in, this is a real place. One other thing I would point out, perhaps has not been mentioned, the problem of taste. The preservationists who rallied in 1965 hated the buildings that were built in the post-World War II era. Most of them were pretty crappy, let's face it. But there were some good ones. Now Mad Men is celebrating these buildings, and we go at it with a new point of view. Preservation is as live and as subjective as anything else. The Four Seasons, Michael and I were there the other night for a Barbara Lee Diamondstein celebration of preservation, is threatened with some absolutely mind-blowingly idiotic renovations that are in the Department of Spite, it seems to me. But the 3-martini lunch is not going away, and we need the proper setting for that lunch. We must rise above our own limitations as human beings. When the preservation movement began, not only was the architecture of the post-war era despised, but that of the Victorian era and the Edwardian era. In fact, people just had no sense of what was good or bad in a certain way in the past, except for a few scholars and people. Now we are a much more educated group. And I also want to say, I'm amazed how many of us are in this room for this event. That shows you how alive preservation is to the future. So I'll rest on Roberta's laurels and turn it back to you, Adele.
Thank you all. Thank you, Bob. Just let's stick with you for a moment, Bob, because I want to circle back to Steve's observation about the criteria and ask you to comment on the 2 Columbus Circle case, where you were a very strong advocate for a public hearing and vigorous debate over that site, although the commission did not vote to calendar the property. And thus it was renovated without being considered. I can't remember a more interesting case because the building was both loved and hated. But you did a great deal, I think, to raise the level of the debate, and to my mind highlighted the fact that cultural significance, which has always been part of the law, something that we could invoke to establish the significance of a property, although we've leaned more heavily on architectural significance than any other and historical significance. But the cultural significance, it seems to me, might have been mentioned as the fight over Columbus Circle took place. What should we learn from that episode that can help us think and prepare for the future, do you think?
Well, the commission should be embarrassed, historically embarrassed. To thwart debate in the public forum is a very unfortunate thing in a democracy. Second of all, of course, we know commissioners, chairs of the commission are appointed by the mayor. And I think that this was a question of politics as much as anything else that undid that building. But if we put those things aside, I would say that to Columbus Circle was a matter of aesthetics, which is one criterion that's used for designating landmarks, but it was also a matter of cultural importance. That building was built to challenge, to house a collection, to challenge the Museum of Modern Art's hegemony of what was modern art, and also to challenge the prevailing modern style of architecture at that time, 1958 or so, by raising a voice for decoration, for classical recall, for a building that actually fit the site rather than just occupied a site as an object. And so there was there was culture, there was aesthetics, and there was history, because Huntington Hartford, the patron, was as interesting and quirky as any patron we've ever had in New York, and we've had some doozies over the years. And he is part of this. His story and how he, his own career was wrapped up in that building, and his attempt to build a pavilion in Central Park, very unwisely proposed and publicly denounced, but he was wrapped up in this history of the city. So there was where one of the great failures of preservation. Of course, it was about real estate, but foolishly so, because you can't redevelop that site for anything much than what it was. And so now we have a kind of bland, boring version of the original building, when we could have had the splendors and the argument points of a real landmark.
Steve, to go back to you, which I think is a good idea as we discuss this, because although the Columbus Circle didn't include a case where we had a disconnect between the Planning Commission's districting and the quality of the landmark, it really had to do with the things Bob is talking about, I think. What do we do about the disconnect between the zoning and the Landmarks Commission's authority? And the Frick certainly would be another case of that, where it's not a question of detailing the design, it's really a question of zoning and mass.
I think what you do about it is you elect elected officials. And whether you like it or not, it's the best system we have. Elected officials make decisions as to what the committee should be or the commission should be. And in that given time frame, their taste, their judgment wins out. Now, that may be a mistake, or it may be the right decision, or when you look back, you may have thought it was a mistake, and so forth. So that's what we live with. So we have a room here primarily filled with preservationists,
And you describe yourself as a
And there's no question, my members own most of the wonderful landmarks in the city of New York. I go to work in one of the great buildings, 570 Lexington Avenue, a terrific landmark. Very proud of it. I talk about it anytime somebody comes to see me. And all of that is wonderful.
And we're glad to have you here, I must say.
We can go to another room filled with people who care about affordable housing, and we can say, okay, in a 10-year period, there was approximately 17% of the housing units was constructed in the city of New York were affordable, and only 1/3 of 1% were created in landmark districts. 1/3 of 1%. And in fact, during that period, 100 units in total of affordable housing was created in landmark districts in the city. One project, the city-subsidized project, generated 95 of them, and one of my members, Douglas Sturz, built the other 5 down at the seaport. So we can talk about that it doesn't affect housing, but it does. And so the disconnect is the following. Who makes the decision as to what are the key issues for the city of New York? How do we create jobs? How do we create housing? How do we preserve our past? And you bring them all together. And I'm suggesting that we have seen a dramatic drive towards preserving at the expense of the city's future for jobs, the city's future for housing, and the city's future for future landmarks.
Is there a way that we can get these things closer together so that, for example, more landmarks can be used for affordable housing as they are to be, or at least old buildings?
Look, I didn't realize you were supposed to come here with written material to attack an industry, but
we're just talking.
The reality is that real estate, it's amazing that real estate developers don't know this, and yet they're making a fortune, yet all of them, at the same time, she suggests would tear down every single building. So it just doesn't seem to make sense. What we have to do is recognize that when you don't allow new growth in an area, you limit supply. You limit supply, cost goes up. Cost goes up. I mean, Roberta is very proud to say that the landmark districts are the richest zip codes in the country. Diversity is down. Incomes in landmark districts are 2 to 2.5 times greater than the citywide average. And maybe that's what some people want, and that's fine. But it's also another factor for an administration that cares about where you're putting people, where you're letting them live, where you're trying to find jobs, that you have to deal with that issue as well. So how do you solve the problem? You don't take cheap attacks over an industry that manages and maintains, again, some of the great buildings in the city of New York, proudly so, and builds some of the great buildings of the city of New York. And you try to deal with the legitimate issues and try to come up with that balance. How do we create the space to build affordable housing? How do you create the space to build those office buildings that need to compete with other parts of the world? And how do you generate the revenue to provide the services to the city of New York? My industry, by the way, the real estate industry, just from the income-producing properties, generates 41% of all of the locally generated revenue for the city of New York. In terms of the real estate taxes, in terms of their transfer taxes and payroll taxes. 600,000 well-paying jobs directly from the industry. And we want to pay more. We don't want to pay higher taxes, but we want to pay more by creating more housing, affordable and otherwise, more office buildings, hotels, and everything else that allows this city to be the future that we want it to be the exciting place that we want it to be the place where people want to come, work, and play, and we need to do that by not making the entire city of New York a museum.
Can I just, by rebuttal, if only 4% of the outer boroughs are designated,
That's the total of the whole city.
There's less than 4% is landmark, right?
Of the whole city.
It seems to me that the real estate industry has plenty of playroom. Have you gone to the Bronx? Have you driven even in the neighborhood where we're sitting, just a few blocks to the east? Have you driven on the outer edges of Bedford, Stuyvesant, and so forth? There are plenty of sites awaiting the magic touch of the developer. Get a life.
Claudette.
And have you designed any of those buildings? I'm sorry.
Yes.
Claudette.
I'm going to take some exceptions to Mr. Spinola. And I speak from the perspective of Bed-Stuy and Central Brooklyn, Crown Heights. We are looking at communities that are not the richest. Bedford-Stuyvesant was, the first designation was in 1973. Crown Heights was in the early 90s. Within Bedford-Stuyvesant, when you go into the exhibit, you'll see two buildings. One is the Alhambra, and the other one is the Renaissance apartment buildings. Both of those buildings were abandoned for a significant period of time. Through the community activity, both of those buildings were designated on the state and national registry and also New York Landmarks Commission. Both of those buildings are affordable housing. Not only are they affordable housing, they are low-income housing. 130 plus units of housing for people who came from shelters into a home. So the two are not mutually exclusive. There can be affordable housing within a historic district. Along with, for our community, where we're seeing in Bed-Stuy now is that the affordable housing is within the brownstone community, is within the historic community. Because Bed-Stuy is, of all the districts in all the areas in Brooklyn, has the largest growth in new residents, has the largest growth, the largest amount of 33 new permits for new construction, as opposed to the next highest is Bushwick with 11. So what we're seeing is, on our upzone streets, we're seeing the tear down of old buildings and the building of new high-rise buildings and the displacement of those residents. What we're seeing where people have affordable housing are within the 1, 2, 4 family houses in the historic districts or the older flats buildings in the historic districts. So if we lose that, if those buildings are gone, if they're torn down, where will those people go? This is a community for us. When we talk about, for us, it has been a place where so many, especially the African-American, Afro-Caribbean people in New York, this was the place where we built our homes. And for us, the designation is not just about preserving the buildings, it's about preserving the legacy of our families, our first opportunity of home ownership. And through that, we look, the average price for a one-bedroom apartment in a new building in Bedford-Stuyvesant right now is about $1,700. In a brownstone apartment of the same size, it's about $9,000. There's a sense of family where people will keep a tenant because they know them. While in the new construction, it's all about market rate apartments. So within our community, we have that. We have affordable housing. We advocate for affordable housing. We are working, the community board, the Bed-Stuy Society for Historic Preservation. We are working within that context with developers and local community developers to build affordable housing within the historic areas. So they're not mutually exclusive, as Mr. Spinola has said.
Except there hasn't been any.
There has been.
There's been 100 units
newly created
We have-
affordable units
well-
in 10-year period, and I just described where they are.
But is that the fault
Is
of
it-
the president?
But is that the fault of
designation?
that is,
Of course it's the fault of the designation.
so in order to create.
Let's hear from Vishaan on this, just to add to the mix a little. And Vishaan.
I will try to keep mixing. I would just say that we can absolutely afford to debate these issues, and we should, but we shouldn't allow ourselves to become paralyzed by them. And the reason, Roberta, I think, mentioned both London and Paris, and that's an interesting contrast, because those are not the same historic city. London has created a way to grow. London has a very active social housing program. London is building the most extraordinary rail infrastructure probably in the developed world. Paris, lovely as it is the most segregated place in the developed world. And there is a definite reason for that comes from form and from policy. When I used to be the head of Manhattan City Planning under the Bloomberg administration, and I met my counterpart from Paris, who explained that they had so mummified the city that they had lost hundreds of thousands of jobs to Frankfurt, to Lille, to London. We cannot afford that. And so that does not mean mowing down historic fabric. Take the affordable housing plan, for instance, that the mayor has put forward. So they've already talked about the fact that they need to preserve 120,000 units before they try to build 80,000. Again, we did a different study up at Columbia. That 80,000, we believe the vast majority of it can go in as infill development at scale with our existing neighborhoods like Bed-Stuy.
Let's stick with that just for a moment. And aren't there non-contributing sites within the historic districts that can be developed appropriately for affordable housing?
I will say in our historic districts right now, we do not have our historic district, the two, 136 buildings. There are no.
I mean, this is the gas station.
I think there's one. Yeah. No, we have one non-contributing vacant lot in the Stuyvesant Heights district. And we are working with the mayor's housing plan. We have the list of lots that he's building, and we are working. We've reached out to those developers. We've reached out to other developers, and we've had the conversation with them about building buildings that communicate with the existing environment.
And so, there seems to be more potential there than is coming out in this conversation, though, within the historic districts or within range of the historic districts.
We have to be able to build building. I mean, if you look, Berlin launched an enormous housing program in the 1980s called the IBA, the International Bauauslegung, that was some of the world's best architects, and Michael knows this very, very well because he lived in Berlin, built social housing and built infill fabric and so forth. But here's the thing, and I think it goes back to the London example, and I think if we're going to act as preservationists, we also have to acknowledge the fundamental development pressure that a city like this is under. We do compete with Singapore. We do need some large office buildings. We do need some larger scale developments. So I said 70% could be in those infill neighborhoods. The other 30% we're going to have to accept are going to be some fairly large scale developments like Atlantic Yards. We're doing the Domino project, which has a landmark on it. We worked with that community board. We had a 29-3 vote in favor of our plan from that community board. There was a lot of concern about materiality, industrial materials, and so forth. So I think, again, it's this question of how one mixes the old with the new and isn't irresponsible in looking at new development and understanding that that new development needs to occur, needs to be channeled, needs to happen in certain places, and that we are adult enough and good enough and global enough as a city to do that.
And inventive enough.
And inventive.
Michael.
Yeah, and I mean, I would second what Vishaan said. I mean, Paris is a very interesting example because you do have a large historical center, and Paris has developed in such a way that it constantly pushed the poor out. It has this, it has the périphérique, the ring road, which literally describes a historic area within which there are a lot of, it's not completely historic, but there are, it is difficult to add housing. Paris is at the moment trying to create more affordable housing. It has not very much land to grow on, so the city has goals of creating, it has now 13% affordable housing within the city and is aiming towards 20 or 25% by 2030. I mean, it's a kind of fictional number. But it has, as we do here in New York, issues, of course, of where in historic areas you put the housing. But, I mean, I wanted to say something, and it's interesting in New York because, of course, I think what Vishaan's pointing out and what Bob is saying too is there's a lot of land in New York City. There really is. And I do think that it was interesting for me to come back from Europe and see how the conversation is polarized between development and preservation. Much as we all say the same things, we want historic buildings to be preserved, and yet we love the fact that New York is a very flexible place. Really, the conversation is not very nimble. I personally agree with Vishaan that there are areas that we need to be much more open to development in. I grew up in the Village, and there's no more historic preservationist neighborhood probably conscious about that than anywhere. And I think there's been appalling stuff built in the Village, some of it by NYU and some of it now building going up along University Place and so forth. That said,
at 12th and University.
Yeah, that said, it's absolutely true.
The Ballmore. Right?
Yeah, over the Ballmore. That's true, a 23-story building or something. That said, the Village is also unaffordable to me. And I mean, I do think that we need to be open as a city to kinds of growth. And this is what I meant in the beginning by saying we need to think in a much more holistic way about what makes healthy. What are we preserving? We're preserving a notion of the city, of communities, and of the health and diversity of the city. And that takes something more, I think, complex than just the application of a law or handing developers the keys to the castle either. I know I'm saying something that's hard to pin down, but I do think we need to move forward in this conversation, and it's difficult to be precise about how, but that's the challenge.
Is there any thought being given to having another category of designation where you could designate property that has potential but that it is not landmark qualities, so that, and perhaps provide a financial incentive with that, so that there could be the development of affordable housing in properties that are of a scale that is familiar.
Can I just say one last thing about that? Because
Sure.
I'm not qualified to answer that question really, but I mean, I may say, and I don't know if Alicia's still here, but I personally am struck, and I don't know how many of you others here are, by this 200,000 number. I mean, the mayor made this commitment and now is trapped or feels trapped to achieve a number. It's a completely arbitrary number. I mean, we need far more than that, and at the same time, what kind of units are they and affordable to whom? It's this single-minded and insane focus on a number. So, I mean, this is also what I'm saying. This is not a way to think about development in the city, either from a economic standpoint or from a humane one.
Well, and there's another question, which is, can you do needlepoint to get some of those 200,000 so that it's not a one fell swoop all the time? It is developing buildings that have great futures because they're still sound and they're still there. I mean, there's something about the fact that a lot of architecture can continue to exist and be comforting to the community and remain an addition to the community because they're used to it and it's there.
Roberta
and
wants to say something.
Exploit that a bit more. Roberta.
First of all, so much of this conversation and the tension that we hear about on not allowing growth or not allowing affordable housing, it's all really about Manhattan. And we are a 5-borough city. and there is 96% of the city undesignated. And I would like to say that no, Vishaan, we don't need more 90-story buildings. If we need growth, it can come in a much more sensitive and with all the density that you need. We have room for that. But to try to put this whole tension on the back of Manhattan is where we're going wrong. And number two, I would like to say, as far as job creation, every study has shown that the restoration and renovation of existing buildings creates more jobs per dollar spent than new construction. So we are, the preservation community has created an enormous amount of jobs, and we've created new industries. All the industries that go into the restoration of buildings. When my husband and I bought a brownstone in the late 1960s, we couldn't find someone who knew how to plaster a wall or build back a stoop. These are now part of our creative industry in this city. So the problems that we're facing, certainly, let's not put it all on preservation, that this city is now too expensive for even so many in the middle class. This is not preservation's fault, and in fact, it's not even our city's fault. It's a national issue, and let's try to find other ways of dealing with it. And we do know how to use tax incentives. We do know how to create social programs, if we want to, without assuming that we have to tear down buildings in order to do it.
Claudette.
Well, I think one of the problems that many of us are having is the planning, the zoning for quality and affordability, because it is sweeping. Now, we individually choose to live in specific neighborhoods for various reasons. We live, I for one, have never and will never live in a high-rise. I like to be near terra firma. It's a thing. I like a garden. So people live and people choose to live in a neighborhood because of how that built environment makes them feel, how they relate to that built environment. When communities sit down and do their zoning, they do that based on the community, based on the needs of that community, and how we interact with each other and how we interact in that environment. So when you take that and you put these sweeping changes, it changes the fabric of that neighborhood. It changes how we relate in that neighborhood. So if we're going to do this, we need to go back to the individual community boards and have that discussion. Where can this neighborhood, I look at Bedford-Stuyvesant, and Bedford-Stuyvesant to me is significant because it is the African-American, historically African-American neighborhood that survived in New York. It survived the 60s. It survived the riots in the 60s for the most part. It survived the 70s New York going bust. It survived planned shrinkage. It survived redlining. It is a neighborhood that survived all this, where we had a strong middle-class African-American, Caribbean-American community. And they have built that environment. So when you come and you want to make these changes, the conversation has to be with them, because you forsook them for so long, and now you have come.
And what it really sounds like here is that we're not getting into what the interim possibilities are, what the sort of, we're talking black or white about whether it's going to be all new or all old.
Yeah, and the conversation needs to be with, we have started that conversation.
It seems to me there are lots of options within the historic districts.
There are options.
And on the edges.
Because even in Bed-Stuy right now, just today somebody gave me a call, and there's a person who's building on the end of what will be part of the Bedford district when it gets designated, and they actually wanted to have a conversation about what they should build or how. They wanted to have that conversation with the community. So a lot of this can be community driven. A lot of this is a conversation.
And there's a lot of trailblazing work that can be done in answer to that question, too. Let's go back to Vishaan. He doesn't look happy.
I'm always happy. I'm turning 50, Adele, remember?
Cry me a river.
You're the baby on the planet.
What did you say? Everybody heard it but us.
What did I say? I said, cry me a river.
Yeah.
Because I think deep down inside, everybody at this table is interested in what you're talking about, which is not being a mummified city, but instead being an alive city, taking the full contribution of the preservation, that 4%, increasing it a little where it's called for, and mixing that with the new and the vibrant, and I'm looking at Michael because of his globe trotting, and where you've seen it in other cities where you have a mix. And how do we get there? I mean, how do we use this as our starting point? How do we exercise the law so that it encourages more preservation, but perhaps in a speedier way, which I'm convinced could happen if the budget were more adequate? I mean, this is an agency with a very clear mandate, and it seems to me we could go faster and have less delays if there were a better funded operation. But anyway, that's a detail. But how do we, Michael and Vishaan, if you two want to tackle this question, how do we mix it in?
You're the birthday boy.
Yeah, birthday boy.
So, I mean, look, clearly we should landmark our true landmarks. And I still find it astonishing, some buildings that I sort of stumble upon that should clearly be landmarks that have not been landmarked yet. And so I do believe there's still work to do. And I believe that districts are important, again, when the fabric is real and it's not about, keeping a parking lot from getting redeveloped. But with that work in tandem, we have to look at our major areas where we can develop. So for instance, we did a plan that suggested that we move the Javits Convention Center. I don't think anyone's moving to landmark the Javits Convention Center. All right, I hope no one's moving to landmark the Javits Convention Center. We did a plan. He's not 50, Bob. To Sunnyside Yards. Build a real convention center out there, use the land value of Javits to pay for a new platform at Sunnyside Yards, create about 25,000 units of housing between the Javits site and the Sunnyside site. Those are conversations that obviously need to be had with the communities in both locations. But the point is there's capacity. And that doesn't mean that you therefore, if we don't figure out valves, control valves, to deal with development pressure. We have 1 million new New Yorkers coming to this city. Where are they going to live? Who speaks for them? And we have to have some pressure valves, right, to keep the pressure off neighborhoods like Bed-Stuy. And that, to me, is the fundamental issue, that if we are so concerned about the fabric of our existing historic neighborhoods, then we absolutely have to look at these big swaths of available land, a lot of it's post-industrial land, and say, how do we create good, solid, mixed income, mixed use development? I'm sorry, just one last thing on this housing thing. And with that new housing, and Michael talked about the 200,000 units, and I'm not saying the administration is saying this, but I am a little worried right now that there is such an obsession about the number of units that if it means the building is made out of cardboard, but you can get 2 more units out of it, that's an okay thing.
What do we do about that?
Well, we have a 900-unit all affordable housing project in Long Island City that the Bloomberg administration put a tremendous amount of pressure on us to make that a nice building, because low-income people should live in a nice building too. And so
it's a future landmark.
And that is something that I'm not saying that the administration has gone the other direction, but I don't hear the same focus on it. But again, the key point is having those development valves.
Michael.
Yes, so, I mean, I agree. I haven't heard the administration talk very elaborately about what kind of housing it wants to build. I was just in East New York, and where obviously there's been a lot of discussion about potential new development. Because you have streets like Atlantic Avenue, which have a lot of empty lots and room for development. And, you know, if you're a homeowner in that neighborhood, new development there is a good idea. And frankly, if you're not a homeowner but you rent to that neighborhood, you want places to go. Meaning you need a grocery store, you need supermarkets. So development there is a very good idea. But what kind of development? What are you creating? You can't just build housing units, because if you go elsewhere in East New York, you see what I meant when I mentioned earlier Robert Moses era housing. You see the complete failure. You see NYCHA projects which have nothing. And you know, this
won't last.
Right. So this is what, you know, I totally agree. I understand where Roberta's coming from, but I myself am not somebody who doesn't think we can't have a 90-story building. It's not, in other words, it's not necessarily just about height. It's all context. And
it's context, it's where it is, and it's varying the height, where the transportation is, and so on.
Absolutely. I mean, by the way, height itself, to me, I've never understood as an issue.
Yeah.
I mean, there's nothing arbitrarily bad about, I mean, there's nothing intrinsically bad about having a tall building. It depends on where
sometimes
the tall building is.
It's bad if it's right next to
My garden.
the old merchant.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
Or Claudette's garden. Bob Stern.
Garden is Central Park.
A 6-story building on a street of 2-story modest houses can be just as egregious an intruder.
Truly.
And that's one reason
right.
for the preservation of neighborhoods, to
Right.
provide a certain measure of stability so homeowners will invest in their own neighborhood and not feel that something is going to come in that will cast a doubt on their gardens.
Right. And
Yeah,
that's,
but I know that I've had this Singapore thing thrown at me by the real estate board before. We have huge opportunities already underway to make Singapore right on the Hudson. We have Singapore on the Hudson called Hudson Yards. And other developments, and there's plenty of land right on the south of the United Nations, which just sits waiting for the magic wand of the developer to make up his mind that he's going to do something, which was so urgently pushed through the public process probably 15 years ago. So I'm not worried about that. I am worried about over-densifying around Grand Central Station because the couple of $100 million doesn't sound like a lot of money to me to compensate for the public density of that place. But I do think there's plenty of opportunities outside the city, outside the central city. And I take the train from New Haven to New York all the time. I look out the window when we go up around 125th Street. 15 years ago, there was devastation there. There are blocks and blocks of what I would describe as relatively affordable housing. But there are also schools there and parks there. Not one of us has mentioned schools. You can't build housing without schools, and that's why people don't want to be in the city. It's not only the rent, it's the shortage of schools, the overcrowding of schools, and perhaps an indifferent educational policy as well. So preservation is part of a larger matrix, but I'm all for 90-story buildings, as long as I get to do a couple of them myself.
Yeah, I was going to say. You've got one in Philadelphia, don't you, Bob?
Claudette, you want a parting shot? We're just going to have to wrap up here. Oh, well, I was looking at your face. No. I think that one of the things we haven't touched on, but that is certainly an issue for the coming period, is that those who are trying to get everything organized and planned and foreseen in advance are never going to be happy with the preservation dynamic, because so much of it has to do with things coming of age and becoming of interest. Once an epoch is closed, you can't really always predict what is going to be of interest and what is the right thing to do about it. In other words, you can't always predict ahead of time what is going to be designated. But certainly the Domino Sugar development, you want
which
to be...
has a school.
Which you want it to be designatable because of the quality.
I hope so.
And that seems to be something that could be talked about a bit more, although maybe not now. Roberta.
I just want to add, I think as the subject of the area around Grand Central is obviously the next frontier of this battle, and it's going to be a hard one. And I just want us to begin to really distinguish between density and congestion. I walked down Broadway just 2 days ago, and I could barely get through Times Square. And the big secret about closing those streets was not for all the reasons that we celebrated, but because you can't walk on the sidewalks anymore. There are too many people in a lot of our neighborhoods. And when Bob talks about the Grand Central area, it's not a lack of density there already, and just crowding in is going to really tip or go in a direction that's going to make it totally uncomfortable place to be in. I also want to point out that I served on the Landmarks Commission for 7 years under Commissioner Tierney over here, and we approved a lot of very interesting new buildings in historic districts, and we even designated an historic district with a parking lot right in the middle, so that when the new construction was advanced, it would fit in with that historic district and not stick out like a sore thumb. Not every historic district has to have in it all the same quality of buildings, but one can observe that as those districts do change, and they do change every year, the quality and type of change will fit in with the larger district. And that's really what we're talking about when we talk about new construction in historic districts. It has to make sense. Otherwise, it overwhelms, overpowers, and distorts the historic district.
Parting shot. Stephen?
Yes.
I want to see a smile on your face.
Well, I'll just comment. Obviously, I think the rezoning of Grand Central was actually a concept that we urged the previous administration to deal with. You have, people may like this, but the average age there of an office building is 73 years old. I may like my landmark building that I'm in, but for many tenants that are looking for big open space, they're either finding them in older loft buildings or they would like new stuff, which Wright Hudson Yards will probably be offering. But the Grand Central area is basically has always been known as maybe the greatest office market in the world. It is wearing. It's got serious problems, and this is a topic. I believe the first phase, meaning Vanderbilt, will go ahead, and then the second phase will be dealing with it. And that but it's another example of the issue. Vishaan, if you want to know when someone might propose the landmarking of Javits, just suggest that you're going to build a big building on it, and there'll be an outcry for a landmarking. And so I think, and that is really what happened.
I promise not to advocate designating Davidson.
A little self-control, thank you. I think that is also what happened at Grand Central. Buildings been around for decades, and when there's a proposal to possibly change it and rezone it and come up with some new buildings, all of a sudden 3 landmark groups propose 93 different buildings to be landmarked, and it's amazing the 3 groups, only 7 of the buildings were on each of their lists, so that it was which is not a criticism or anything, but it indicates how everybody has different opinions as to what is worthy of landmarking, what is not, what kind of building.
Thank you, Stephen.
The final thing in defense of the mayor and the housing plan, we clearly need that kind of housing, and part of the what the mayor has articulated is, and the reason it's taking the rezoning is part of the effort to look at what kind of schools, what kind of parks, where we can build that, and it's taking a great deal of time, but I think it's being done. It's taking that time because it's an attempt to do it correctly.
Bob Stern, a parting word.
I hope the Yale Club was on everyone's list.
Claudette. Keep up the good work, Claudette. Let's have Michael while you recover.
I'm good. As preservationists, we are not opposed to new buildings. We are not opposed to affordable housing. We would like it to be in context of our existing environment. Change is inevitable. Change is going to happen. But within change, we also like consistency. Our landmarks provide consistency. It provides that look to the past. It provides, for us, it's an emotional connection. For some of us, it's a family connection. But we need to know part of our human existence is managing change and keeping some things consistent. And when we look at our communities, when we look at the new zoning plan, we want to manage that change ourselves. We want to manage that change so it works for our specific community and not a holistic approach that we see the new administration taking.
Thank you. Michael.
Yeah, so I mean, I would just say, in terms of the area around Grand Central, one of the interesting things to me about that was that surely if we're going to think in terms of developing that area, we might want to begin with the question of, improved subway service, improved streets, the public spaces, and I know there was some attempt to think that way, but it's a good example of, it seems to me, of trying to marry public interests and development. It was an unusual case that there was this thwarted attempt at some kind of public plan and funding of that plan. If that kind of thing moves forward, then there might be real space for some development that also begins with an idea of the public realm. I can't help it because I'm here and you're a captive audience. I decided to start with the frick, and the reason I did it, even though I'm very grateful and glad that we've segued to these other issues, is because, I mean, to me, it's a small example. It's not just an example of a elite cultural institution, but an example of the same sort of how can you manage growth. The frick should be allowed to grow. It's an important cultural institution. We love it, but it has other aspects, which include public space, or at least a place on the street that the public appreciates. So again, it isn't about thwarting growth, it's about smart growth.
Vishaan, we're getting the hook.
Okay, I'm just going to... Penn Station.
Yeah.
Penn Station. The Farley building is not... Don't let anyone lie to you. Penn Station is not moving lock, stock, and barrel into the Farley building. We had a round on this where we had a plan to move the garden into the back of the Farley building and could have gotten a new Penn Station. And quite frankly, not every preservationist, but some preservations did not behave very well and took out ads saying that it's happening all over again. What happened to Penn Station? It was poppycock. Right? We lost an enormous opportunity. We can't do it again. It's unsafe. It's embarrassing. We have to fix Penn Station. And preservationists should lead the charge on this for a new building that's a great train station at Penn Station.
Wow. What a thing to finish on. See you in 50 years to discuss all this again.
Now, thank you. Thank you all so very much. Join us across the street